How does a routine safety test turn into a nightmare where thousands of men sacrifice themselves to save Europe? Stick around, because today we're covering the entire story of Chernobyl. The Chernobyl disaster was a real event that occurred on April 26, 1986 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Soviet Ukraine. It is the worst nuclear disaster in history. For context, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was one of the largest and most powerful nuclear facilities in the Ukraine part of the Soviet Union. It had 4 operating RBMK-1000 nuclear reactors that together could generate about 10% of Ukraine's total electricity production at the time. So when Reactor 4 exploded, it released about 400 times more radioactive material into the atmosphere than the Hiroshima bomb. Alright, let's get into it. The first episode opens in Moscow on April 26, 1988, 2 years after the Chernobyl disaster. A man named Valery Legasov sits alone in his apartment, recording tapes about what really happened at Chernobyl. He talks about how they blamed one man for the whole incident, but Legasov knows the truth is way more complicated. When he's done recording, Legasov steps out of his apartment to hide the tapes, just as a government agent watches him from a car. Legasov then returns to his apartment, feeds his cat one last time, and hangs himself at 1:23 a.m., the same time the explosion happened 2 years ago. We then jump back 2 years to April 26, 1986 in Pripyat, which is a residential area near the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine. Firefighter Vasily Ignatenko and his pregnant wife Ludmila are jolted awake by a massive explosion. They rush to the window and see this eerie electric blue glow lighting up the night sky from the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Inside the power plant's control room, things are quickly falling apart. Reactor No. 5 has just exploded during what was supposed to be a routine safety test. Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov refuses to accept reality. Workers are telling him the reactor core exploded, but Dyatlov keeps insisting that it is impossible. The design of the Soviet-made RBMK reactor cores don't explode, he says. It's physically impossible. Dyatlov is convinced it was just a hydrogen tank explosion. The first dosimeter reading comes back showing 3.6 Röntgen per hour. Side note, a dosimeter is used to measure radiation levels. Dyatlov insists that it's not terrible because 3.6 Röntgen looks manageable, but workers close to the reactor are already severely burnt. The real situation is much worse than he's letting on. The dosimeter that he's measuring from has a maximum reading of 3.6. It can't go any higher than this. Before leaving to meet with management, Dyatlov orders 2 engineers, Akimov and Toptunov, to manually flood the reactor with water to cool it down. Meanwhile, firefighter Vasily gets called to the scene with his fire brigade. The firefighters arrive by 1:30 a.m. and start battling the blaze, completely unaware they're walking into a death trap. There are chunks of deadly graphite fragments scattered in the rubble. One firefighter picks up a piece, and his hand gets cooked within seconds. Back in Pripyat, Ludmila's neighbors want to watch the fire from a nearby bridge, but Ludmila thinks it's dangerous, so she refuses to join, which ends up being smart because the people on that bridge are getting blasted with insane amounts of radiation and they don't even know it. Meanwhile, Bossman Dyatlov, plant manager Viktor Brukhanov, and Chief Engineer Nikolai Fomin meet with the Pripyat Executive Committee. The committee collectively decides that everything is under control, nothing to worry about. They refuse to evacuate the people in Pripyat. They block all communication to the outside world. They dismiss anybody who suggests otherwise. Something is definitely wrong, but they're hiding it. After the meeting, Deputy Engineer Sitnikov shows up and reports to Dyatlov, Fomin, and Brukhanov on what was going on back at the plant. Sitnikov explains the radiation levels weren't safe at all. He reports that their 1,000 Röntgen capacity dosimeter wasn't working at all, so they found a 200 Röntgen dosimeter instead, which immediately maxed out. For context, a safe annual dose for a worker is about 5 Röntgens. The dosimeter pegging at 200 Röntgen means the workers are absorbing a fatal dose in minutes, which is absolutely insane. To think that the real number is even higher than 200 is honestly terrifying. Sitnikov thinks such levels should be impossible, unless of course, the reactor core exploded. But of course they don't believe him. Brukhanov and Fomin order Sitnikov to climb up to the roof for a visual inspection. Just as this is happening, Dyatlov suddenly collapses due to acute radiation sickness.
Get him to the medic or the hospital, whatever he needs.
The guard takes him out of the room and immediately gets sent to a hospital. Back in Moscow, Legasov gets a phone call from Boris Sherbina, the deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers. We then find out that Legasov is an inorganic chemist, and Sherbina calls him because he needs an expert to assess the situation and answer questions from authorities. Sherbina tells Legasov there's been an accident at Chernobyl. He plays it down as just a tank explosion, but Legasov immediately recognizes that this is serious. He suggests evacuation. but Sherbina says it's none of Legasov's business. Well, you did call him, you know? Meanwhile, down in the plant, Akhimov and Toptunov manually open valves to flood the destroyed reactor, their skin already deteriorating from radiation exposure. The episode that ends with a disturbing image of the radioactive smoke drifting toward Pripyat, killing wildlife as it spreads. Episode 2 kicks off 7 hours after the explosion, and we're taken to the city of Minsk. Nuclear physicist Ulana Kamyuk is working late on a Saturday when she notices something terrifying. Her radiation detectors are picking up levels way higher than normal. She and her colleague run tests and realize they're detecting iodine-131, which is a radioactive material that only comes from a reactor fuel breaking apart. It shouldn't be there at all. Finding iodine-131 means the reactor core itself has been damaged. They figure it must be coming from the Ignalina nuclear plant, about 240 kilometers away. Fun fact, Ignalina is actually where they film the nuclear plant scenes for the show. Anyway, when they call Ignalina, everything's fine there. Then it hits her. If Ignalina's okay, and the radiation is this high all the way in Minsk, that means Chernobyl, 400 kilometers away, must have had a core explosion. She tries calling Chernobyl, but there's no answer. Something is very wrong. Back in Pripyat, the hospital is in absolute chaos. Firefighters and citizens are flooding in with radiation burns so severe, the nurses don't even recognize what they're looking at. Once they realize these are radiation burns, they immediately strip the firefighters of their contaminated gear and dump everything in the basement. Meanwhile, Ludmila desperately searches for her husband, Vasily. She finds out he's already been airlifted to Moscow along with other critical patients. The hospital staff literally drags her away from the contaminated firefighters for her own safety. In Moscow, Legasov reads the official report about the explosion and immediately spots problems. During a committee meeting, the officials are brushing off how serious this is because they've been assured the radiation levels are within safe limits. They're relying on those initial reports and don't seem to grasp that the situation might be far worse than what they're being told. Legasov stands up and points out all the mistakes in the report, explaining that if the core is actually exposed, the radiation could be catastrophically higher than reported. General Secretary Gorbachev is convinced enough to send Legasov to investigate the disaster alongside Sherbina, who is extremely skeptical of Legasov. On the helicopter ride to Chernobyl, Legasov looks out the window and sees the unmistakable blue glow of ionized air and chunks of graphite scattered on the roof.
Look, that's graphite on the roof. The whole building's been blown open.
His worst fears are confirmed. The core is exposed. When they land, Legasov and Sherbina confront Brukhanov and Fomin about the graphite and radiation levels, but the stupid plant managers accuse Legasov of spreading misinformation. Sherbina's had enough. He orders Army General Pikolov to drive around the plant with a high-range dosimeter and get actual readings. Pikolov does it himself, driving through the radiation in a lead-lined truck. When he returns, the reading isn't 3.6 Röntgen, it's 15,000. The fire is releasing twice the radiation of Hiroshima every single hour into the atmosphere of the city. It's been 20 hours, and it won't stop burning. Sherbina finally gets it, and immediately has Brukhanov and Fomin arrested. Legasov suggests dropping sand and boron from helicopters to smother the fire. The next day, helicopters begin dumping 5,000 tons of material onto the exposed reactor core. During one of the drops, one of the helicopters gets a little too close to the reactor building. It clips the crane cable and crashes directly into the core, but Sherbina orders them to keep going. This mission can't stop, even for the dead. Meanwhile, Legasov tells Sherbina that despite being far from the plant, they're still absorbing deadly radiation. In 5 years, they'll all be dead. Wow, what a casual way to deliver a death sentence. Then Sherbina gets a phone call. The radiation has been detected in Sweden and Germany. The Americans have satellite photos, and the whole world knows. With their cover blown, the authorities start evacuating Pripyat. Meanwhile, Kamyuk arrives at Chernobyl to meet Legasov and Sherbina. She tells Legasov his solution is flawed. All that sand they've been dropping is heating up and melting into lava. The firefighters have also flooded the basement tanks with water. When the lava hits the water, it's going to cause a massive steam explosion that'll destroy the remaining reactors and spread radiation across all of Eastern Europe. Hearing that, they all fly back to Moscow and present the problem to Gorbachev. The solution? Send 3 plant workers who know the plumbing system into the highly radioactive basement to manually drain the water. It's a suicide mission, but Gorbachev approves it. At the plant, Legasov and Sherbina ask for volunteers, offering large bonuses. The workers refuse until Sherbina tells him what happens if they don't.
If you don't, millions will die.
3 men step forward: Ananenko, Bespalov, and Baranov. They know exactly what they're walking into, and they do it anyway. They suit up and descend into the flooded basement. As they wade through the contaminated water searching for the valves, their flashlights start flickering and dying, leaving them in complete darkness. Episode 3 opens in the flooded basement, where the 3 divers' flashlights have failed, leaving them in total darkness. They switch to backup flashlights and manage to complete the mission. The divers emerge from the basement wet and exhausted, but they were alive. They successfully located and opened the valves to drain the water, and against all odds, they did survive. But there's no time to celebrate because by May 2nd, Legasov and Sherbina are already knee-deep in the next crisis. The reactor core is melting down faster than anybody expected. The concrete pad beneath the reactor will only last 6 to 8 weeks before the fuel breaches it and melts straight into the freaking groundwater. If this happens, the Pripyat River feeding into the Dnieper, the primary water supply for approximately 50 million people, would be contaminated forever. They need a solution, and they need it fast. Legasov's plan is to install a liquid nitrogen heat exchanger directly underneath the reactor. The exchanger would cool down the core and stop the meltdown. But here's the problem. There's no way to reach that spot from inside the building anymore. The only option is to dig a tunnel under the entire plant and access it from below, which means they're going to need miners. They're going to need a lot of them. After the immediate crisis is averted, Legasov and Sherbina step outside for a walk. Sherbina asks what will happen to their boys, the divers, the firefighters, and the men in the control room. What does the radiation do? I'll tell you, it's really bad. The radiation causes severe blisters, then everything falls apart. The immune system fails and organs decompose. The pain is unimaginable, and in just a couple of weeks, they will die. For Legasov and Sherbina, they've gotten a steady dose, not strong enough to kill cells immediately, but consistent enough to cause cancer. As they walk, Legasov notices 2 people watching them from a distance. He's seen them before, and then it hits him. Government agents called KGB have been here the whole time. They're watching their moves. Meanwhile, Shatov, Minister of Coal Industries, travels to Tula to recruit a coal mining crew. When he arrives at the mine, the crew chief, Glukov, and the miners are immediately hostile. A government official shows up demanding 100 men get in trucks for a classified mission. Yeah, it's not happening. The crew chief threatens to have his men beat the living piss out of anybody who tries to force them. This is their mine. They don't leave unless they know why. So Shatov tells them the truth. The reactor fuel is going to poison the water from Kiev to the Black Sea. All of it. They need the miners to stop it from happening. The miners know exactly how dangerous this is, and they agree to do it. Glukov and the crew then head to Chernobyl to do this impossible job. And Legasov explains they need to dig under a melting nuclear reactor core. Glukov asks the obvious question, is it gonna fall on top of us? Well, not if you're done within 6 weeks. The crew immediately get to work, but the conditions are brutal. The heat is so unbearable that the miners eventually go butt naked. They're still wearing the hats though, I'll give them that. In Moscow, Ludmila bribes hospital staff to see her husband. She gets 30 minutes with strict instructions never to touch him. But the loving wife that she is, she ignores all of it. She holds Vasily's hand, refuses to leave his side. She even tells Vasily that they're going to have a baby, but he can barely respond. His body is falling apart. Meanwhile, Legasov sends Kamyuk to the hospital in Moscow to interview the dying operators and find out what exactly happened that night. Dyatlov refuses to cooperate, still arrogant and unpleasant even on the sick bed. But Kamyuk gets answers from Toptunov and Akamov. These men are barely recognizable as human anymore. Toptunov is only 25 years old, and he's rotting from the inside out. Toptunov explains he reported a power increase to Akamov. Then Akamov tells Kamyuk something that should be impossible. He pressed AZ5, the emergency shutdown button, and the reactor exploded. It's not supposed to happen. The emergency shutdown is designed to prevent meltdowns, not cause them. Both men confirm the same story independently. It means something is wrong with the reactor design itself. She just can't explain why. During her visit, Kamyuk sees Ludmila inside the plastic barrier, touching Vasily, holding him close. She's horrified that the nurse let her in that room and threatens to report the hospital's negligence. It's a big mistake. Kamyuk doesn't realize KGB agents were in the same hospital, working to suppress information about what was really happening at Chernobyl. She was arrested that night. Meanwhile, Legasov and Sherbina present their decontamination plan to the Central Committee on May 7th. 2,600 square kilometers around Chernobyl will need to be evacuated, and all the contaminated areas would have to be set on fire. Legasov says they need to build a massive structure around the reactor to contain the core. They'll need a lot of hands, about 750,000 people. Yeah, that much. It's going to take at least 3 years. As always, this job also comes at the price of death. How many? They don't have an answer. After the meeting, Legasov meets the deputy chairman of the KGB directly, Comrade Charkov. Legasov talks to the deputy and secures Kamyuk's release. She needs to keep investigating. They have to know why the reactor core exploded. The episode then ends with the quiet devastation we knew that was coming. Toptunov and Akamov finally lose their battle with radiation. Ludmila stands with the other widows as Vasily dies and gets buried alongside the other victims. Zinc coffins, sealed in concrete, because even in death, their bodies are too radioactive. It is devastating to continue to remember that all of this is real. It really happened. Episode 4 opens with an 82-year-old woman milking her cow when a soldier shows up telling her it's time to evacuate. She's not having it. This babushka has seen everything. Her parents and 2 sisters are already dead. Her brothers never came home from World War II. Now some kid with a gun is telling her to leave because of something she can't even see. The soldier, clearly running out of patience, empties her milk bucket. So what does she do? She just starts milking the cow again. Now this puny Malaka just puts a bullet through the cow. 4 months after the explosion, Legasov and Sherbina are facing a different nightmare. They're thinking of covering the roof of the reactor to reduce the radiation, but there's one big problem standing in the way: the highly radioactive graphite debris scattered all over the roof. This graphite came from the reactor core itself during the explosion, which means it's putting out lethal levels of radiation. They can't build the cover until that debris is cleared off, and anyone who goes up there to remove it is not going to last very long. They need to figure out how to throw the graphite debris back into the reactor, because with that on the roof, they just can't do anything. They're sitting across the table from General Tarakhanov, the military officer in charge of the entire cleanup operation, weighing their options. Legasov has divided the roof into 3 levels, and every single one of them is a death sentence if you spend too much time around it. At the end of everything, they decide to try remote-controlled moon rovers lined with lead. Meanwhile, at a military camp, we meet the Animal Control Squad. Yeah, it's exactly what you'd think. Their job is to shoot every contaminated animal left in the exclusion zone. Here's Pavel, a green civilian who, like many others, just got drafted into the Soviet military. The young lad is paired with Bacho and Garo, hardened war veterans. Sure, they're absolutely thrilled to babysit the new guy. Back at the reactor, they test one of the Soviet moon rovers on 2 of the roof levels. The thing actually works, moving graphite around like a champ. Look at that. Soviet engineering for once. This model can handle 2 of the 3 roof levels. The third one is much more dangerous. The rovers can't operate under those radiation levels. They need a more powerful machine, and the Central Committee came in clutch with a robot borrowed from West Germany. Meanwhile, Kamyuk is busy investigating what actually caused the explosion. She's been going through reports from plant workers, including state archives detailing the design of the RBMK reactor. And she finds an article from 1976 about operating RBMK reactors under extreme conditions. But the author's names are redacted, and 2 pages are missing. Someone is hiding something. She interviews Dyatlov in the hospital, who's now looking much better, but the dude still won't say anything. Dyatlov says he's no idea what could have been on those pages. September 1986 in Chernobyl. The Germans finally sent their finest, most sophisticated robot. It moves 1 meter forward, 1 meter back, and everyone cheers. Then, it just gave up on life. The bot lasts just 4 seconds before the radiation shreds its circuits. Turns out, the Soviets told the Germans the maximum radiation was 2,000 Röntgen. They give them false information to protect the state, so the robot was never going to work. Now they're desperate. They try coming up with insane ideas like pouring molten lead from helicopters, but none of it is going to work. That's when Legasov quietly suggests biorobots, his label for innocent young men. They're going to send men up on that roof. Jesus. Back to our hunters, where Bacho lays down the ground rules. If Pavel lets any animal suffer, he'll kill Pavel himself. It's a solid icebreaker. On their hunt, Pavel discovers a mother dog and her puppies hiding in a house. He completely freezes up. Instead of shooting Pavel, Bacho handles it himself. Apparently killing puppies is where he draws the line. 1 month later, General Tarakhanov briefs the brave soldiers on their mission. Their job is to get onto the roof, grab the graphite blocks with a shovel, and throw them over the edge into the reactor hole. Don't stumble. Definitely don't fall through the holes in the roof. Whatever you do, don't stay out past 90 seconds. It's a tough job, but despite everything, over 3,000 men complete their shifts and they clear the roof. In December 1986, Kamyuk, Legasov, and Sherbina meet up in some sketchy part of Pripyat to discuss a serious issue. Dyatlov, Brukhanov, and Fomin are going to be put on trial, and Legasov will be needed in Vienna to give his expert testimony to the world. It's smart to be on the same page. While they're at it, Kamyuk shows Legasov the article with the missing pages. Turns out he's seen it before. In 1975, while operating an RBMK reactor, the operators pressed AZ5 to stop everything. But instead of shutting down, the power surged. Here's why. The control rods are made of boron, which is supposed to stop the nuclear reaction, but there's a fatal design flaw. The rods have graphite tips on the end. Graphite doesn't stop reactions, it speeds them up. So when you press the emergency shutdown and those rods get shoved in the reactor, the graphite tips go in first. That means for a brief moment, before the boron can stop the reaction, the graphite actually accelerates it. The reactor spikes in power right when you're trying to shut it down. Now you'd think after discovering this back in 1975 they'd immediately fix it, right? The Soviets knew about this flaw, just kept on using the graphite tips because they were cheaper, cutting costs over, preventing a nuclear meltdown. That brilliant decision is exactly what doomed Chernobyl. A colleague named Volkov warned the Kremlin about this flaw 10 years ago, but the KGB classified it as a state secret. Can't have any doubt about the supremacy of the Soviet Union. Side note, the Chernobyl disaster wasn't entirely because of this design flaw. The operators didn't know the flaw existed, sure, but they also made a series of reckless decisions that pushed the reactor to the edge. The design flaw was the fatal weakness, but the way they operated that night is what triggered it, so it's kind of both. Kamyuk wants Legasov to reveal the truth in Vienna, exposing the flaw in all 16 RBMK reactors still running in the Soviet Union. Sherbina thinks it's better to keep things quiet and fix the flaws, but Kamyuk isn't having it. Kamyuk had enough. Someone needs to start telling the truth. She tells them about the innocent people who died due to his lie. She also mentions Ludmila, who gave birth to a baby girl that unfortunately only lived for 4 hours. The radiation would have killed the mother, but the baby absorbed it instead. Ludmila really should have listened to those nurses. The episode that ends with General Tarakanov congratulating the final group of 3,000 men who cleared the roof. They each get awarded 800 rubles. He wishes them good health and long life. But honestly, we all know that that's just a sick joke. The final episode of Chernobyl kicks off with a flashback 12 hours before the disaster. April 25th, 1986. Bryukhanov, Fomin, and Dyatlov are meeting about the final safety test for the reactor that's been delayed for 3 years since 1983. Dyatlov got the reactor prepped to reduce power output for the test, but then they get a call from Kiev. The grid controller says they can't lower power for another 10 hours because factories need electricity. But the test needs a low power output to proceed successfully. Bryukhanov asks if they need to suspend the test, but Dyatlov says no. They'll wait and the test will proceed as planned. Yeah, this guy definitely made the wrong move. Back in the present, it's March 1987 in Moscow. Legasov gets rewarded for his testimony in Vienna, where he blamed everything on operator error. He pinned the disaster entirely on Dyatlov and the control room operators for ignoring safety protocols and making reckless decisions that night. Charkov offers him Hero of the Soviet Union and a promotion, but before that he has to testify before the state at a trial. Legasov asks about the reactors being fixed, and Charkov says it'll wait till after the trial. Later in the episode, Kamyuk shows up at Legasov's place. She's not here to scold him about Vienna. She tells Legasov the state will never willingly fix the reactors because admitting the problem means admitting they lied. They'll have to be forced. Legasov knows the state will punish him, but he decides to tell the truth regardless. Consequences be damned. July 1987. The trial begins in the abandoned city of Chernobyl. Sherbina goes first. He explains how RBMK reactors work and details of the safety test. Reactor 4 went into operation December 20th, 1983. 11 days later, Bryukhanov signed a certificate of completion. But in reality, the reactor was never fully tested. The safety test had failed 3 times before, and April 26, 1986 was the 4th attempt that broke the reactor. Up next is Kamyuk, and she walks us through the timeline. By 2 p.m. on April 25th, when the test was scheduled, the reactor's power output was at 1,600 megawatts, ready to drop to 700 needed for the test. But then the 10-hour delay occurred. This creates 2 serious problems. By midnight, when the test finally happens, there's already a shift change. The problem is the new staff have no idea that a test will be conducted. Even worse, they haven't been trained for it at all. Also, the 10-hour delay in low power led to poison buildup in the reactor. So when Akimov and Toptunov try to lower power to 700, the reactor stalls and drops to 30 megawatts. Akimov wants to shut it down for 24 hours per protocol, but Dyatlov loses it instantly. He threatens their careers, tells them to raise the power instead, so they start pulling control rods out. The brakes were completely pulled out, with nothing to regulate the reactor. Dyatlov denies giving the order, but the fact is overwhelming. At this point, court goes into recess. During the court break, Sherbina and Legasov sit outside, and in an emotional moment, Sherbina admits he thought he didn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, but Legasov thinks otherwise. Nothing would have been done without him. They had everything they needed because the state believed Sherbina. He was the one that mattered the most. When the court resumes, Legasov takes over the testimony. At exactly 1:23 a.m., there was a power surge. Akimov hits AZ5, the emergency shutdown button. You press it. All control rods insert at once. Reaction stops dead. But there's a fatal flaw in the reactor's design. The control rods have graphite tips. When they're fully removed and reinserted, graphite enters the core first, accelerating the reaction before the boron can shut it down. Why would they design it this way?
It's cheaper.
It's cheap. That's why they designed it that way. But it's about to cost them a lot more than they'll ever imagine. The graphite tips spike the power to 33,000 megawatts. Reactor 4 is now a nuclear bomb, and 45 seconds after,
Explosion.
nobody in that room knew the shutdown button could act as a detonator. Those redacted documents contain these flaws, but the state kept it a secret. The RBMK design was built on a lie, and it's collapsing right before the state. Even at that, the state will refuse to admit the truth. The KGB takes Legasov aside. They tell him his testimony won't be accepted by the state. It won't appear in any press. Won't be published anywhere. He gets to keep his title and his office. But that's where it ends. They're going to erase his legacy. No duties, no authority, no influence. And definitely, no friends. He'll be completely isolated. a ghost in his own life, and he could never speak to Pamyat or Sherbina again. When he finally dies, it'll be hard to know that he ever existed. The show then ends with a gut punch. Valery Legasov took his own life on April 26, 1988, exactly 2 years after the disaster. Only after his suicide did the government finally acknowledge the design flaw and retrofit the remaining reactors. Ulana Pamyat was a composite character, representing all the scientists who investigated the incident. Sherbina died August 22, 1990. Dyatlov, Brukhanov, and Fomin served 10 years of hard labor, and Dyatlov eventually died from radiation exposure in 1995. And that is the entire story of Chernobyl. Truly, it's one hell of a show, and covering it has been pretty intense. What do you think about this one? I'm eager to know your thoughts. And for all of you history buffs out there, did this one keep your attention? Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time. See ya.